My name is Natalia Bendito. I work as a principal software engineer in front-end technologies for NetCentric. I am also a Google developer expert for Angular and web technologies, a Azure inclusive hero. I got this badge recently. And I'm here to convince you, if you're not convinced yet, to become an ally. And I'm going to explain you what that means. But first, you have to click the button. Come on, click the button. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. You're in YouTube and you're thinking, what is she talking about? What button? I cannot click any button here for her to start speaking in a live event, right? And this is exactly how some people feel when they are browsing a website or an application that you code, if you don't think of accessibility, right? If you haven't embraced it. So this is what I'm trying to do today. I'm trying to convince you that it's a best thing to do, even if you don't have a business requirement for it. So I have spoken several times about accessibility, both internally and externally, I think since 2015. And I realized that for many developers, accessibility is like a very difficult and painful topic, and they don't know where to begin with it. So like I said, unless it is a business requirement, they are not putting a lot of attention to it. And I think if we start thinking about accessibility as a form of inclusion, as a form of making our sites, our applications more inclusive, then we're going to give a little bit more care to it. The World Health Organization, that you probably have been hearing a lot about because of the COVID, says that 15% of the population deals with some sort of disability, from severe to mild, right? So there are physical disabilities related to sight, to hearing, motor disabilities, cognitive disabilities, like, for example, dyslexia, which, by the way, I think 12% of the people that have dyslexia don't even have a diagnosis for it. So just imagine. Obviously, people with these conditions benefit the most from our accessible implementations. But in reality, we can all benefit from inclusive design. So there is 15% of the population of the world, which are a staggering 1 billion people that have a disability that may require the use of assistive technologies to navigate an app or site. By assistive technologies, I mean screen readers, I mean braille readers. Even there are some devices that you can blow into them and to create input. But there are also people that are not part of this segment of population and still can leverage an accessible interface. So tell me you've never been, I don't know, super tired after many hours of work and start finding it super difficult to read because the contrast is not enough. Or I don't know, maybe you have acute carpal tunnel inflammation and it's difficult to use a mouse, or you don't have any more batteries in your mouse. So maybe you forgot your glasses at home. It happened to me many times. I got to work and, oh my God, I forgot my glasses because I only use them to read. There are so many reasons why we can benefit from accessibility. And in order to measure how much we can benefit from accessibility, there are some levels of compliance or success criteria. There are 3 of them, which determine how perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust a user interface is. It's A, AA, and AAA. For content to be understandable, a rule of thumb is to provide your views or pages with organized structure by using main, section, header, footer, or aside, for example, instead of generic div elements, and use landmark roles when they are not implicit. Those elements mentioned above, like I just mentioned, they have implicit landmark roles. For example, header, the role is header, obviously. But if you use a div instead, for example, for your footer, for some reason, you can give it the role footer, and you should give it the role footer for people with assistive technologies to understand that they have reached the end of the page, right, or of the view. It is also very important to define a hierarchy for content using headlines from H1 to H6. One very important piece of advice for Angular developers is that when composing your Angular views, because you have all the components like modularized, you have to check often how they play together, right? So don't just wait until the end. Check how they are playing together when they're composed, when it's a composite and they're nested or they're siblings to other components. And why structure, as we mentioned, is so important? Because a best practice is to put HTML elements exactly in the order that they should appear in the page. Try not to modify them with CSS or JavaScript. Now, that's something we usually do, front-end developers. We use Flex and then we swap things around. But that's not very, very accessible. So we have to think about it when we do it and try not to abuse it too much. Because depending on the order and the hierarchy of content, it is how the browser will generate both your graphic user interface and the accessibility tree, which I represented in this slide by all these dots. So it's a tree used by assistive technologies like screen readers to navigate the page. Another very important guideline of the WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, where a lot of stress is put, is that you should always provide a text alternative to your controls and your graphic elements. Here we have a simple image component template, right, that we will use in multiple places, and it binds an alt property or alternative text property to provide an alternative text for each instance of it. The WCAG also recommends that we always use the dedicated HTML native element when it is available. For example, if you need to use a button, well, use the button element. And why? Because when you focus an element, all the keyboard controls are transferred to that item, including what is called the synthetic input events. So if you use the proper button element, for example, instead of just a div or an anchor, if you add an event listener on click, it will automatically work when you focus it and hit enter in the keyboard. So you don't have to do anything else. You get a lot for free just by using the native element. Let's suppose that we have a specific requirement for which it is useful to infer the focus to an element that is not natively focusable. Like, I don't know, a div, like it is represented in this slide. We can achieve that with the tab index attribute. It is a best practice to use only 0 and -1. 0 to make it, or to give it the focus, to say this element can be on focus, and -1, so we skip it while navigating. So it's still focusable, but we are skipping it when tabbing with a keyword. Since other positive values can lead to a very, very bad user experience. I made the mistake once when I just began implementing accessibility back in the day to give like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's not a good practice, because first of all, if you give a positive number, that number will be higher on the list of things that the screen reader will read, or the tab keyboard navigation will go to, instead of things that are natively focusable. So another very important factor to make content understandable and perceivable is the color scheme used. A very common problem is the lack of sufficient contrast between background and foreground colors. In this example, for example, we see two buttons with different ratios. There is obviously a great difference for certain users with reduced sight abilities to understand the first one, right? Because it's kind of the same hue. So UI and UX designs may not be up to the front-end developers or the web developers, and that's understandable, but you can still review them to identify problems before you start the technical implementation. And you can always raise a hand and say, hey, I think this may not really work, right? So we have some takeaways already. First of all, we must ensure there is a good and well-thought user experience, because designers may not be aware of accessibility specs. And things that we should not do is implement contrast that don't pass the minimum ratio. There are tools online where you can check that. We should not implement animations that are too fast, random, or create flashes of light. And we should not expand or collapse items on hover, for example. I don't know if you've ever experienced a flyout that displays on hover, and then for some reason, there is a gap between the trigger and or the button that triggers it, and the active area, and then every time you want to reach a, I don't know, maybe there is a link inside and want to click it, and it goes away. Just imagine trying to keep that flyout out when you have Parkinson or some other motor disabilities is completely impossible. The second takeaway we have is to use native HTML5 elements and attributes instead of repurposing, because we want to preserve the implicit semantics, the built-in and synthetic events, and we want to guarantee the inferred focus. So now we know the very basics, we can already start implementing the use of ARIA, or Accessible Rich Internet Applications, also known as WAI-ARIA, or Web Accessibility Initiative ARIA, which is a set of special attributes that enhance that accessibility tree that we were talking about. So it makes it even better than it was before, because it kind of translates the visual UI to a spoken UI, even for those elements that are not natively supposed to speak to the user. The most important use of ARIA is to give accessibility features to elements that usually don't have any, like we just said. So basically, it allows you to create accessible widgets out of HTML markup. Let's describe those semantics. The role is important because it tells users how to what they should expect from the interaction with a widget or with the content, and what they can get out of it. The name provides a text alternative for the controls, and state and value are, well, pretty self-explanatory. But what is important is that while role name and value are properties, state is a condition that is probably going to change, right? So in the code, you can see a representation of programmatic semantics. In this case, the role would be the combo box, and it's implicit because the select boxes are combo boxes. And the name comes from the for attribute in the label. It is important that you always keep the ARIA authoring guidelines at hand, because as you can imagine, not every element allows for everything. Not every element allows for all roles, properties, and states, even if you can put them programmatically. So let's see an even more evident case. Right? This is a special case of a checkbox created with a div. The highlighted example will be completely misunderstood by the browsers, by the screen reader, or the user browsing. The only thing the screen reader will read is check me if you're an ally, but it will not tell the user what they have to do. It will not tell them it's a checkbox. The second case will be read exactly as if it was a native checkbox, because we have programmed it to do so. We have added the tab index, so it's focusable, we have added the role checkbox, and we have even added state, it's checked. So this is basically how you'd code that in your Angular template. You have to pay special attention at how we bind ARIA as attributes and not as properties, because they don't have a corresponding DOM property. ARIA can also help establish relationships between elements, even if they don't have a parent-child connection, or they are not siblings, they are maybe a bit far away in the DOM. Like in this example, using the ARIA controls attribute, so the user that is sight impaired knows what elements they are controlling with this switch. This would be the HTML output, and this is how we bind the ARIA attributes in our template, again, in order to reuse the button component over and over with different values, right? Another very useful attribute for SPA developers is ARIA Live. In this case, we use it implicitly by giving our error message the role alert, which means the value of ARIA Live will be assertive. We can also use ARIA Live explicitly and give it a value of either assertive or polite. And what does that mean? Polite will wait until the user finishes whatever they're doing, right, to read the new content or updates, and assertive will interrupt the user, so they respond to this message right away. What may be a problem with assertive is that it will probably interrupt the whole queue of content or other messages that the screen reader may have pending. So you have to use it very careful also not to interrupt the user every time because you just updated something in the UI that is not really relevant. So in that case, you can let them know with polite, but use assertive only for real. Like, I don't know, in this case, if we go back, there is a required input that was not filled or was not filled properly, and then we can inform the user that something is wrong. So there is one caveat to ARIA, and is that it doesn't play any role but the one of enhancing the accessibility tree. So you still need to add keyboard support on top of it. What this means is if you bind this ARIA attribute to an element, but unless you write a logic that binds that to an event or a key event, nothing else will happen, right? Fortunately, this is not hard to do. We can implement the keyboard event interface key, which is a read-only property for key that returns the value of the key pressed by the user and even takes into consideration the state of a modifier key, like it could be, I don't know, shift, and even the keyboard locale and layout. Now, with all you know in mind, you're ready to make more accessible apps, right? And another useful piece of advice I could give you in terms of accessibility would be to use skip links. Skip links are like a navigation item, usually found at the top of the page, that can take the user to a certain part of the content right away. Because imagine you are browsing a site that has a mega menu and has hundreds of links. You don't want to go over them every time, right? That's really not a good experience. Also, we probably want to avoid keyboard traps in dynamic elements, for example, a slider. This is repeated over and over in accessibility, that users get into something that is some element that is dynamic and they don't know how to get out of it. So you always need to make sure that the users can get out of every dynamic feature. And finally, you also have to make sure that they can go back to the browser. This is incredibly important. I feel that now we can start putting together a checklist. So we can say that we can use the first things we mentioned, review the UX and UI design for potential accessibility issues, use native HTML5 elements and attributes instead of repurposing, compose your view structure following the natural flow the user should follow, use ARIA implicit and programmatic semantics to infer role, name, state, and value, provide alternatives to controls and graphics. If you need to control an element's focus, use the tab index with values of 0 and -1, and make sure your users can browse with the keyboard only. Also provide enhanced navigations means like skip links and anchors to reach content in a more in a faster way. And we can also put together a list of don'ts, right? Do not repurpose elements by changing the role. For example, don't give the role button to an H1 or H2, whatever, a different kind of role, implicit role. Do not use a generic element like div if you have a native element available, because you lose a lot of controls. Do not reset browser default styles unless you provide alternative indicators like the focus ring. I see this very often. I used to do it myself, reset the focus ring because it doesn't look good or it doesn't match the design specification, but you always have to provide an alternative, right? And do not let users get caught in keyboard traps. So if you're ready to remember all this advice and you start implementing or continue to implement accessible interfaces, then Skoll, you're very likely already in compliance with level AA or close. But obviously, please read the WCAG specifications, the why ARIA, and check whatever requirements your client may have. Before we move on, I wanted to mention quickly that level AAA success criteria, it is more about content and technical implementation. So this is why I'm not going to go through it. It's about, I don't know, giving transcripts for audio and video content and hence super content like that for screen readers and users with disabilities. So we are not going to cover that. So we learned a lot, and yet this is only the tip of the iceberg, right? Even after so many years of working with accessibility in mind, I am not sure about a lot of the rules. And we have so much to remember as front-end developers that a little automation help is always welcome and appreciated. Luckily, in Angular, we have the possibility of performing static code analysis for accessibility together with the regular linting with Codelyzer, right? So all we have to do is we extend our TSLint configuration with the available accessibility-specific rules. There are about 10 of them. And for example, the highlighted one will make sure that you add alternative text to all your images. This one will make sure that you add a for attribute to all your labels. This one ensures that you don't add a tab index value other than -1 and 0 that we already discussed is a bad idea and can cause trouble. And this one makes sure that if you are adding a click event listener to an element without synthetic controls, you have a key event associated. So if you install the TSLint plugin to your IDE, then you have tips and indicators at development time, like with other linting errors or issues. And you can also run nglint to get a detailed list of issues to fix across your many files. So you can basically see all your errors and actually break your build when those errors happen. You can even execute nglint in your CI pipeline. You can add it to your, I don't know, GitHub Actions, for example, or if you are in the Jamstack in Netlify, you can add the nglint command to your deployment command or your build command. This is something I definitely recommend you think about if you're working for the public sector. Especially some countries have very, very strict accessibility legislations, like the UK and Israel, and some other European countries are also adopting the new legislations. So you need to think about this. But static analysis is not sufficient. It's not really sufficient. We should always try to perform manual audits. Not sure how many people in the audience have ever performed a screen reader test. I wanted to do this in this presentation, but then I thought, no, it's going to be too much because it is very hard and it's highly unlikely to be effective because super users, I've seen screen reader real users use these technologies and it's impossible to follow. They do it at a speed that is impossible to replicate if you're not a user, a regular user, right? So we cannot really reproduce how they use and the bugs and the issues they will find. But one thing I can recommend is that you agree on a screen reader or even an assistive technology support matrix with your client, because the results between the many options, for example, you have JAWS, you have NVDA, you have VoiceOver, highly vary across the browsers and devices. And together with the screen reader test, you can use a Chrome Accessibility Inspector to inspect your items and learn more about the accessibility features you're offering and those you're missing as well. So in the screenshot, you can see how it gives a very comprehensive information about name, role, state, and value of the element inspected. And you don't have to do anything. You just have it for free in your Chrome developer tools. It's just one more of the inspecting tabs. You can also use the Lighthouse audits, which are directly integrated as well in the developer tools. You can even skip all the other categories and just go for accessibility. And Lighthouse will not only give you a score, but it will give you tips on how to solve your current problems. Lighthouse lets you know that only a subset of issues can be detected, and you're encouraged to perform, again, these manual audits with screen readers. However, like I mentioned, they are very, very difficult to do. And if your clients, again, are serious about accessibility compliance, if they have a target, if they are enterprise or public sector, you should probably leave the audits to third-party experts. There are many people that do this or offer this service. But still, please think with our code with accessibility in mind, so you can include more people in the internet and make the internet a good place for everyone. So this is all. Thank you very much.